All right, I'm going to start. Thank you everybody for joining us for this conversation between Angelina Gualdoni and Paul Laster. I'm Asya Geisberg, and Angelina Gualdoni's exhibition, The Physic Garden, is on view at the gallery, closing today. And our other participant is critic and curator Paul Laster. Angelina has been with the gallery since we opened our doors in 2010, and the Physic Garden is her 5th solo show at AGG. I've known both Angelina and Paul for many years and look forward to them sharing their thoughts today. Angelina and Paul will be diving into Angelina's painting process, as well as her interest in herbalism, medicine, and how the herb garden became a part of every cloister and monastery in later medieval history. For Angelina, botanicals function in a myriad of ways, as environment, decor, symbol, and salve, inspiring her to create works that oscillate between sensorial and analytical approaches to painting. And now to introduce our speakers, Paul Laster is a critic, editor, curator, artist, and lecturer. He is the New York desk editor at ArtAsiaPacific, a contributing editor at Whitehot Magazine of Contemporary Art, and writer for Time Out New York, Harper's Bazaar Arabia, Galerie Magazine, Sculpture, Art and Object, Cultured, Architectural Digest, Garage, Surface, Upstate Diary, Conceptual Fine Art, and Raw Vision. He was the founding editor of Art Crush, started the Daily Beast's art section, and was art editor of Russell Simmons OneWorld Magazine, as well as a curator at P.S.1 Contemporary Art Center, now MoMA PS1. Angelina Gualdoni received her BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore and her MFA from the University of Illinois in Chicago. Her paintings have been the subject of solo and group shows nationally and internationally at the Crystal Flowers Art Salon, the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, Tufts University Galleries, the Queens Museum, the St. Louis Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Aldrich Museum, the Museum de Pavillon, Netherlands, and the Neuberger Museum. Her work resides in the Saatchi collection, as well as the collections of the MCA Chicago and the Nerman Museum. She has been the beneficiary of several grants and fellowships, including the New York Foundation for the Arts in 2008 and 2015, the Daynard Faculty Research Award, Artadia, and Paula Krasner, and has attended residencies at Carrizozo AIR, MacDowell Colony, Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, the International Studio and Curatorial Program, and Chateau Lanupoule. And finally, just a quick note that if audience members have any questions, please write them in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the discussion. And we would appreciate it if you kept yourselves muted. Thank you.
So I'm going to just open my images here for the discussion with Angelina. And we're going to take a quick look back at the evolution of her painting since she started showing at Asya Geisberg Gallery in 2010. Shadows Slipping was the inaugural exhibition at the gallery. It opened the gallery in that year. So in the press release, it says you began your paintings by pouring thin veils of paint directly onto the canvas, and then you found something in the shadows and defined it or pulled it out. How did you come to this technique, and what did you like about it?
Staining, I've been staining canvases from about 2002 until now. So the stain came in as an extension of a lot of gestural oil painting that I was doing in much more representational paintings of dead malls. But I'd been searching for freedom both when I started painting and when I did this show. So the dead mall paintings were very highly rendered. There was a lot of taping going on, a lot of sharp edges, and I gave myself a very tiny area to play with oil paint. And eventually that felt too constrictive. And I thought, what if I reverse the process and put all of the stain, all of the spill, all of the kind of liquidity of the paint onto the surface at first? And that led to these stained backgrounds. And I continued with these architectural dead mall paintings for most of that decade. And at a certain point, felt much too constricted by the use of the photograph. I felt really hemmed in and kind of tired of working with that source material. And so when I was working on the work that eventually would be for Shadows Slipping, I wanted to kind of free myself. And I ended up taking out a lot of things, the photograph, the source material, and I was becoming just more minimal, formal, and improvisational in my approach. There's still a kind of obsession with luminosity that is going on here, and a kind of almost, driving towards a sensorial or mystical kind of visual experience. But frankly, I found it, and there are also echoes of still life and kind of tabletop and interior. But overall, this kind of pared down abstraction, I found it fairly difficult to sustain a dialogue of the language of abstraction that I had available to myself at the time. And I wasn't really sure exactly how to advance my thinking in this direction.
Yeah, I think this is a real interesting point of departure because, artists, when they're oftentimes want to start a new body of work, they might eliminate color or eliminate forms that they'd previously used. And here you've really pared it down to, you've got the action of the pour in the background. And as you said, that, the acrylic ground there, and then the oil painting on top. And this one, untitled Diamond. I mean, we see the diamond there, but the diamond itself is quite abstract as well. So I think it's a really interesting point of departure that then you continue to build upon. And in the next show that you had in the gallery was in 2014. And in your Held in Place, Light in Hand exhibition, the imagery emerging from the abstract pours becomes a bit more representational and is defined by a geometric form that's framing it, and reinforced by the use of a collage or manipulated photo as the point of departure. I think you told me that this was a collage background that was your point of departure here. Could you deconstruct the making of this painting, which is titled Whatever It Is, Wherever You Are, so that we can better understand your thoughts and process of painting?
Yeah, absolutely. This was actually the first painting that I made when I got back in the studio after the birth of my daughter. But it's the third version of the first painting. So I had a kind of watercolor and drawing that had some collage elements that I knew I needed to make this image first. And a lot of things had shifted for me after having her. Time and energy were at a premium. So when I did get to the studio, I didn't really have the time to mess around in the way that I was when I was making abstraction, like, oh, will this work, will that work? Like, I had to have something that would work. And so this is where I started making works on paper that would precede the paintings. But even then, getting back into painting, like figuring out exactly how do I get the luminosity, how do I invite this sense of interior architecture, was still kind of something that I needed to figure out multiple times. I also knew that pattern was becoming important to me, but I didn't know exactly how I wanted to use it yet. And so at this point, I had started looking at Sonia Delaunay as a kind of model and a reference point. And so some of these echoing triangular patterns in the background were inspired by some of her textile designs. But mostly I was trying to reflect this experience of being inside kind of day after day after day with a newborn. And the way that you become very attuned to the way that light might pass through an interior space. And having this vase form that is both like a presence and an absence. While it looks completely white here, what you're actually seeing is just the raw canvas. Everything else is painted around it. So it becomes kind of this blinding whiteness, and it's there, but it's not there at the same time. And it casts a shadow, but it emits light. And so I was kind of like wrestling with, you know, the new person in my life and being kind of held in one place because of this new person for a very long time.
Yeah, I love this painting. I first chose another painting from the show, and then I came back to this because this, I'm a big fan of Sonia Delaunay's work, and also though this has to me the complexity of a Jasper Johns. Particularly when Jasper started to bring in the figure or bring in objects into the abstracted background as well, and I that comes out in some later work too, the richness of that composition.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, he's someone that I look at quite a lot still to this day, particularly his work from the 80s and 90s and more recently as well. So.
And then this painting, Carriers, is from the 2016 exhibition Folds and Fields, which continues your growing interest in still lifes and interiors and the sustained color field approach to the ground. But the compositions are becoming more layered through the use of a pattern painted on the backside. This type of on the left side of the painting, this kind of shadowy image that seeps through to create a ghost-like image. These patterns are sourced from early 20th century women artists such as Sonia Delaunay and Varvara Stepanova, a Russian artist who was the wife of Rodchenko. Objects in the paintings are, and some of the objects in the paintings are enlarged to an architectural scale. So what led you to start painting patterns on the backside that faintly show through to the surface?
Well, it's funny that it really took me this long to realize this, because at this point I've been staining for, 14 years. And it was really economy. Like I was working on a painting and I worked on it too much. I lost the luminosity. And as I went to strip the canvas off of the stretcher, I turned it over and I was like, this looks like an interesting ground. Like what happens if I just work on top of this instead? And, that was an incidental ground. But then I started studying what is it that makes some paint be able to pass through the other side and what paint doesn't. And so I kind of did a lot of testing one summer about like types of canvas, types of acrylic paint, conditions that it needed in order to come through the other side so I'd be able to control it more intentionally. At the same time, I'm starting to read and research more about Delaunay, as well as Stepanova, Varvara, and think about all of the different things that they're doing, like all of the different things they're handling. Delaunay was a mother and a partner. She designed textiles. At a different point, she designed murals and theater. Varvara was kind of left fine arts to become also like a textile designer, a theater designer. And at the time, I was balancing being a mother, a professor, chair of my department, and part of this artist-run gallery space, Regina Rex. So I'm identifying with these women who have who have all these different things going on and feeling similarly. And so it's almost through this affinity that I'm thinking about the patterns in their life and the patterns in my life, and how can I bring this into my own spaces. So I started planning to use particular patterns, and I would start the painting on one side and paint the pattern and kind of call it through, and then unstretch the canvas, restretch it, and then paint the interior space that had representational depth on the other side.
Yeah, I really, both Delaunay and Stepanova kind of predate the concepts of Bauhaus as well, in that, you know, they were working, like you said, in with textiles, in fashion design, in costume design, in set design, and you know, they all had so much to contribute. And also too, here in particularly like in this painting, the layering and level of complexity and mystery in the pictures make me think of like Francis Picabia or Sigmar Polke, or, you know, David Sally, who was influenced by both Picabia and Polka. So I'm really, this has added such a wonderful addition to what you were previously doing. You know, I love the evolution that we can see here. So in your 2018 show at the gallery, Casa della Nuova Strega, which translates from the Italian to House of the New Witch, there's a marvelous marriage of the poured spaces and articulated objects. You continue to play with ideas of staining, 20th century color field painting and textile dyeing, as well as patterns of the 20th century women artists on the backs. But the still life becomes even more defined, and the subject matter of witchcraft with the devices and materials for making potions and spirits enters the picture. Where did this new interest develop, and how did you research it before bringing it into your work?
Well, at this point, I'd been foraging for about 3 or 4 years. Foraging started because my father, I had seen him do it for years and years in St. Louis. I had not done it myself, and I kind of took to the woods after being completely burnt out by being chair, and it was kind of a meditative and restorative practice. And the thing is, I was looking for mushrooms, but when there aren't mushrooms around, there are plants. And so I was kind of like, well, I'm not seeing what I'm looking for, but I see this and I see this, and what is it? So I'd accumulated some knowledge and experience, and I'd also joined the New York Mycological Society at that point. And when I was going to the studio, this was kind of a turning point where the abstracted silhouettes no longer felt like quite enough to engage both the feminist histories as well as the locations that I was kind of traveling through. I'd seen the Carrie James Marshall show at the Met, and I'd studied with him at UIC, and I've always kind of looked up to him. And his work reminded me of the power of specificity. And so I started being much more specific about like what types of ceramics I was painting and from what schools, and the relationships of ceramics to feminism. And at the same time, I was like, well, I have way more knowledge than I have before about specific plants and what they do. And so I'm going to start bringing all of that to bear on this body of work, which was basically trying to reimagine what a new witch, what a contemporary witch would be. It would be someone, you know, who's interested in ecofeminism, the environment, and foraging, and in herbalism, but also someone who might, delve into spell casting, wishful thinking, snake oil, like the way that all of these things overlap and kind of infuse in the wellness industry, I think is fascinating and problematic. And so I kind of wanted to create an imaginary interior for this woman, with whom I share some, but not all, of those interests. So it's a bit of an exercise in reimagining what foraging and these kind of activities can do or mean.
And when you say foraging, do you do that upstate or in Connecticut or Pennsylvania, New Jersey?
I actually do it in the city. Like I'm a 5-borough forager mostly. The New York Mycological Society has a long tradition of really getting to know the urban parks here. And for instance, I live near Forest Park, that is one of the largest oak forests in the city. And so it can be quite generous at certain points of the year. And so, it's kind of, I don't think when people who don't live in New York don't understand exactly how big it is or how big some of our parks are. And
Right.
so there's a misconception that you have to go out. Now, I certainly do have other spots, and I'm always looking for new ones, but mostly it's in the city.
Now, is that something that John Cage used to do as well? Like forward?
Yes, yeah, he actually, like, there was a society and then he re-co-founded it, I think in the 60s. And there's actually just a really beautiful 2-volume book of some of his writings and drawings about his relationships with mushrooms that came out, I think, last year.
Wow. Yeah, I'm a big fan of John Cage. I've read a number of his books and also have records of his recordings, like his toy piano music and others. It's like he's such a great thinker. And also someone who's so in tune as you are with the world around him. Yeah. So this painting is between the clock and the bed, which is actually the title of a Jasper Johns painting, which he took from an Edward Munch painting famously. This was in an exhibition, Herbal Lore, at Crystal Flowers, NYC, which is the apartment of Allison Wade and the site of the former salon of Florine Stettheimer, which I find a fascinating connection, be a fascinating connection there. In this show, you start to get more specific about the plants you are using in your pictures. How did this next step develop?
Yeah, it really grew out of the Strega idea when I started thinking, well, which plants am I going to put in here? What would I want the plant to do? And realizing that the use of herbs and herbalism and women's relationship to it, whether it be through kind of, witchcraft or as healers, the point was to exert more influence or control over your own body or the future when little to none was afforded to you. And when you're kind of absented from the educational networks, and when the medical establishment is not really giving credence, to your experience, then you seek these alternative remedies. And so it kind of led me to think about kind of the mystical domestic, which I think really started in Strega, and then I kind of continued in Herbal Lore. Where the home is a site of potential transformation instead of stasis. And so between the clock and the bed, I'd been looking a lot at John's. I loved that John's kind of triangular pattern, which looked a lot like Delaney's triangular pattern, actually came from this Munch painting, and so there was this beautiful lineage of a pattern that I kind of figured out. And I also really loved the idea of this space of kind of contemplation of mortality. And I'd been suffering from insomnia quite a lot at this time. And so I was thinking about the time of day or time of night or day, 3 a.m. or so, 3:30, when it's like, you almost give up on trying to go to sleep and your thoughts are at their most operatic. Because you're just out of your mind and you want to rest. And so I wanted to create a painting that was kind of echoes of those previous paintings and addressed the kind of operatic contemplation of mortality that happens, at the time of night or day. And I kind of knew I wanted to use a triangular, kind of like something that traditionally would be used to uplift, or to point towards the skies, but to make it like very kind of dramatic and contrasty, to reflect that drama, and very kind of peaceful outside of it.
Yeah,
So,
I love, and then the more specific plant life too is like in this area here, and also maybe in this painting that's on the wall too. Right?
Yes, and that's also a tribute to Delaney. And the plants here are really where I get specific, and I start kind of asking myself, could a painting function as a recipe, or could a painting function as a prescription for healing? And so all of the plants on here are related either to anti-anxiety, antidepressants, or sleep aids. So there are things like lucuma, cannabis, mulungu root, damiana. So I'm kind of actually like consulting an encyclopedia of herbal medicine to be like, okay, what plants would an herbalist look to, to kind of address this situation? And so the story I told myself was ultimately though, is that herbalism did not work. If you're still up at 3:30 in the morning, your best efforts have still not been able to render you at peace enough to fall asleep.
Right. It's interesting though too, because we started with that almost purely abstract painting with just a hint of the representational, and now here we're really dealing with the allegorical, because what you just explained was that this painting is an allegory for the things that you were going through yourself. Right. It's very interesting buildup, I think, of this narrative. Also in this area too, of these plants, you must have had to research these from books and like use books in order to have an exact representation of them to put them in here. That makes me think of someone like Philip Taft, who has used lots of old books. He has an incredible library of old books that he'll pull, and then there'll be these drawings, illustrations of plants from the 1700s, from the 1600s, to use in a contemporary way. I think that's a very interesting parallel there as well, because you're, this interest of yours, and then this bringing it into your painting has, expanded the content of your painting, as well as the process of learning for you in life as well. I think it's very enriching. That leads into then the painting that is the title of the show here, that's up at the gallery, the Physic Garden. In this work, you visualize your deeper research of herbalism, alchemy, and the historical use of plants, and you introduce the use of string for the mark making, which is how you made this white, kind of almost like a printed area, almost like a woodcut or a silk screen mark making. And the string was initially plucked from the debris of the urban garden surrounding your studio in the industrial area of East New York. And it's interesting because this kind of like a woodcut feeling also echoes the illustrations that, just like I was talking about, that Philip Taft might use, that you found in your research in different books and in libraries. And it also brings to mind, to me, the kind of experimentation with other tools of your using a string, like a Jack Whitten using a comb, or Ed Clark using a big piece of wood to make marks, and a number of other artists have done that as well. So it must have been a great discovery. Tell me about how that came about and how you handle this string in order to make these marks.
Sure. Well, backing up to early 2019, after I'd kind of finished the Crystal Gardens work, I was left with this question of how do women learn recipes and rituals? And I knew I wanted to do more research just on like, how do you acquire this knowledge? So I knew I needed to look at more documents or do some reading on the research part. And then I'd recently moved studios at the same time, and East New York, there's very, very little greenery. There are planters or like, trees and sidewalks, but no real plant life to speak of. But I'm still looking down on the ground because either I'm, it's leftover shyness from being a child, or just kind of curiosity, like what's on the ground. And I found it's thicker than string, and it's not quite cable. It was outside of a tire shop. I did not know what I was going to do with it. It's not like I just saw it, and it was almost like that cage thing where he drops string down. It was like that. And I'm like, string, okay. I'm gonna forage this, from East New York, and I'll bring it to my studio. I had no plans for it, you know. And then I went to Italy to do this research on texts, and I visited Physic Gardens in Salerno. I went to an herbal museum outside of Bologna. And so I was looking at a lot of prints and woodcuts and illustrated manuscripts. The answer to my question was, women probably learn things orally, and there is next to no documentation of that. But if you were able to go to a school, or become a doctor, then you had access to these herbals, and that's what I had access to. So I came back with just a plethora of printed and drawn images to kind of consider for this body of work. And I knew this body of work is unusual for me in that I knew the title of the show before I even knew the paintings. Like once I found the title and learned about Physic Gardens in a book, and Physic Gardens were attached to monasteries and cloisters throughout the Middle Ages as a kind of attempt to both heal the body and soul. And until they were shut down in the kind of greater efforts of the church. But monasteries and convents kept this kind of language of herbalism, often secretly copying and circulating these manuscripts when that image was trying to be repressed by the larger church. So taking all this information and coming back into the studio, at a certain point, I saw these strings and I was like, I wonder what kind of mark they would make. And so I took them and I would paint them white and then just kind of roll them on top of the canvas. And they made this dotted kind of line that is there but not there. And all of a sudden I felt like I had a way to emulate the woodblock and engraving lines that I was looking at, as well as to propose this type of image that was both sensual and analytical, that kind of would echo this oscillation of viewing that happens when you're foraging, where you have to use kind of very diffuse vision to pinpoint texture or pattern or shape or color. But then once you lock into something, you have to then use haptic and visual information and analyze, like, is this actually what I think it is? And that for me, like that experience, this type of vision and being in that mindset is what is truly healing. Like for me, it is that process. And so that's where I feel like I am at my most whole self, and that if I could bring that type of vision to a painting, then like that would really excite me. And so that was kind of the formal impetus for a lot of the work in the Physic Garden.
Yeah, I really, I think this, this additional level of mark making, which when you said dotted line, it made me think of like that Ben Shahn also used to use a transfer method where he'd draw on wax paper and then put a piece of paper on it, and it would make a dot pattern that would be his drawing. And then Andy Warhol copied that in his early work as well. So, it's like this wonderful addition of this mark making, like with the birds here, where one is real and the other is just, just abstractly there. It really adds a wonderful richness. So when we look into your show here too, I love the arrangement of it. The arrangement of the rectangles, the way they kind of carry your eye around the room, almost like if you were looking at a big book. It gives a wonderful feeling, like a coffee table book, like here would be like a double page spread. Gives you like the ideas, the idea of a book here really relates to the fact that you're dealing with ideas in the work. And so, just as you were looking at these old books and manuscripts, I get that feeling when I was in the physical space of the show as well. This painting here, The Herbalist, is, previous painting is the Physic Garden, and then we come to the herbalist, the person who would be using the herbs from the garden to make something from them. So I really love the fact that this really reinforces the idea of what you were talking about, of the look of the woodcut, because this almost looks like your abstract ground with a woodcut or a silk screen printed on the surface. So this must have been very, very labor intensive, though, if you were holding the string bit by bit to make each of these marks, right?
It absolutely was, but it was so deeply pleasurable at the same time. I mean, the pour, I love pours, but pours take place all at once and then you let them dry and maybe you do another. You know, it's a very kind of one shot and then another shot deal. And this is a painting that's process of accretion. It's collecting a lot of marks that build up and make a bigger thing.
Yeah.
And it still does this visual trick of apparition and disillusion, you know, like as much as she's there, she's not there. And so that for me was really key. And so I was just so thrilled to be able to find a way to kind of stay with the mark making for a while here.
Well, too, like, you mean, this makes me think of like Max Ernst when he was doing his frottage works. He talked about that he was a witness of the making of his own work. The fact that you were then doing this bit by bit by bit by bit, as it unfolded, you were the witness. You were like a medium making this piece. You were the total witness to it being made. And it must have been so exciting to be engaged in that way.
It was absolutely. And it was, you know, I'm really not a figurative painter. Like this is probably the most figurative painting that I've ever done. But I felt like it was really important to have that agent pictured, you know, and she's got an apron that has all of these icons on it. And I mean, this was like another image that I found without context. So I don't know how to read exactly the signs and symbols, but I love the idea of this apron that has all these pockets, you know, that you can put the things in, and you know, that within the space of her face, there was almost like a black speech bubble coming out of back into her head. And then like I painted a very tiny little white kind of something escaping from her mouth, you know, it's like an exhale or inhale. And so, you know, it again, like it taps back into that experience of discovery, both in the studio and in the forest.
Right. Yeah, and speaking of the forest, this kind of the repository takes us back into the forest, but it also is kind of like it's almost like there's a fence, a wall. It's like a gate, a walled-in garden that you might find in Italy or France or Belgium, related to a monastery or, you know, a community. Where they have a garden for herbs. I mean, and in that sense too, it would relate to community gardens here in New York as well, you know, where people have little plots. It's almost like it's divided up into plots here, and people have these little plots to work within. So, you know, this one, I think also too, this kind of silhouetted flower arrangement at the top. There's different perspectives going on here. What were you thinking about when you were making this?
That different perspectives part is something that I really want to pursue in my next body of work. And it comes from looking at a lot of these medieval drawings where things are, it's not organized around the single vanishing point. And so you're approaching things almost in a proto-cubist way, where it's from this angle and that angle. And so this is both like, if you could take it as a plan where you're looking underground at a kind of chamber or compost pit that's been buried, you could look at it as a slightly, you know, depth receding where it is perhaps like a walled garden that's been divided into two spaces, you know, or you could consider it metaphorically instead, you know, just like day and night, top and bottom,
Right.
as above, so below. So I'm kind of thinking in all of those things, but again, the inspiration really goes back to the kind of twisting of space that happens in a lot of proto-Renaissance and medieval drawings and paintings.
Yeah, I really like that idea of day and night, like the garden as it's in a somber state as well as in the daylight. And then here in Lunar Blades, again, there's that aspect of day and night, particularly in the title, Lunar Blades. It's as though the tools of the garden, the tools for cutting the herbs, are lit by moonlight. Yeah, tell me about where did you find all of these tools? Was that in another illustration or?
This is actually a real tool set that was in the Aboca Museum that's in San Sepolcro in Italy, which is an herbal museum. And so these are, scythes and kind of lunar blade knives that you'd use to, to cull plants out in the field, along with pruning shears, regular shears. And they were in this fantastic triangular knife holder. And so as soon as I saw that, I was like, I need to make a painting of that.
They make a marvelous still life. And also I love the fact that you layered them here with this kind of like ghost-like image on top. So there is like, and then the triangle as well gives a shift in the perspective also at the top of the triangle, which is kind of the device for holding the tools, but it also takes the eye in to this wonderful kind of horizon up here, very successful. Also, this one I like a lot too, because now Distiller Transformer, the title of this painting, we get to the process of, you've had the tools previously of cutting the herbs from the garden, and now here's the process of distilling the herbs in a kind of alchemical process of taking them and turning them into the potions, which also then relates to your witches as well, to the witches, to monasteries, to science. Alchemy is like predates science. It's the tools that were there, the investigation that gave us science, and particularly too when in the hands of like in the Iraq and Iran and places like that, in China, in other cultures where they were using these processes to discover the things that we now are the foundation for science. So I love though too the bird's head that's on the top, almost like the top of a bottle, in the way that we might have those type of decorated heads on the bottles of liqueurs nowadays as well, right?
Yes.
So what were some of the things that fed into this painting?
The distilling is a process that's shared by actually herbalism and alchemy. Alchemy is something that I touch on, but I'm not sure that I am schooled enough in it to really speak to it in a more specific way than a metaphor for what happens, in the studio process. But I wanted it very specifically, this is the point of transformation of one thing into another. And at points when I was thinking about repository as a compost pit, that is the other side of transformation as well. That is where things become like return to soil and return to dirt and return to grow into different things. And so both repository and this are kind of like hinge points in the show where one thing becomes another.
Right. When I look at this too and thinking about alchemy, you and I were talking about it the other day, that alchemy, to me, I first got interested in it through the work of Duchamp. And when I look at this and I think of, the interpretation of Duchamp's large glass, as this alchemical process, dealing with the psychology of life, this is, brings that to mind as well, these different things pictured within the composition.
That is super interesting, and I'm going to think on that for a while after this. Yeah,
and then here the poison cell is kind of the place where the poisonous materials would be kept as well. So you must have come across this in your research in Italy as well. Yeah.
Yes, there was a poison cell at the Museo Aboca as well. And it's not just that they're poisonous, it's that they're poisonous depending on dosage.
Yeah.
And so certain plants that can harm can also heal, and you just need to be experienced and to know how much to give to someone. And I liked this idea of something so powerful that it needed to be, once it was kind of transformed or dried or distilled, that it had to be locked away in a safe place. And I also wanted a more interior representational painting to still kind of connect the exterior with the interior, and to speak about this process of culling, of sorting, of drawing, all of the actions that someone would take in order to complete the process of transformation. So this is a tabletop. The floor is kind of scattered with debris, which is also a nod to the unswept floor mosaic in Italy, which also served as a huge point of inspiration for the show. Thinking about scraps, and what do scraps indicate other than decadence or luxury leftovers, it's also fragments, impoverishment, and the things that go into compost pit that then turn into other things.
Right.
So all of that was part of the thinking of this particular painting.
Yeah, it's a really, really rich interior. I love the kind of like wallpapering here, and the luminosity that comes through in the cabinet, and then this wonderful arrangement of objects on the table as well. And then this is another kind of, in a sense, a related still life to that. But here again, it shows the technique with the string. And it's kind of like the plant, you've got the imaginary plant growing out of the root. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. This is Lover's Root. It's based on a mandrake, which are so figurative and magical in and of themselves, but kind of with a different, it's a hybrid plant. It's a fantasy plant. This plant does not exist. But I again was kind of separating above and below, and these types of like a haptic, a more viscous type of application of paint in the bottom, and then a kind of more ethereal or alternately analytic type of description on the top.
Right. And then this one, you were talking about the the tile floors in Italy. I mean, particularly when you go in the churches, the Cosimo the technique of the marble floors, the tiled marble floors. It's so wonderful. And this kind of has this feeling of a landscape down at the bottom here, almost like an underwater type of scene here, or plants that would be growing underwater. Tell me about this painting called the Rook Kingdom. What's a rook?
I think that's a typo. It's the Root Kingdom.
Okay.
And so in this specifically, I'm almost returning to this idea of the unseen networks that kind of that support everything that's above ground. And this is kind of a question that I've been chewing on for the last couple of months, is just how do you picture what you can't see?
Right.
Like, how do you come to understand the structure of things that support you, that are invisible to you? And also, like, what are the boundaries? A lot of the way that we identify plants, which you'll see in the confections too, is by separating them from everything. But a lot of the research that's going on right now, that's been pioneered by Suzanne Simard or Merlin Sheldrake, is about the interconnectedness of the root systems and the fungal network underground. And at a certain point, the impossibility of entirely teasing apart what makes one unit distinct from another. And so these are things that I'm thinking about, and kind of as I start to draw and paint roots and root systems and networks a little bit more.
Yeah, this has a feeling almost like a terranium, is it? Like
Yeah.
like a glass box, like an ant farm would be, where you can see the action underground, and that we're seeing is the action underground here. And then this is one of the, I'm going to go through a few of these confection paintings. This is Cherry Kernels, which is here. And this is the bleed from the background. And this is Saffron. Wonderful. I love the way you outlined it, almost like a seed package here. And then this is Cloves and star anise, which my mother used to use to make cookies. And here we have the star anise with the back of the painting that shows how you've done the painting on the backside that bleeds through and that we see here. How did you stumble upon this process? You said, I think you touched on it earlier, right?
Yeah, it's really the same process as the patterns, but for this one, I wanted specifically to kind of insinuate that there's all of this context of the underground that supports the thing that we pluck. You know, we see it's almost like the same critique of the hero as the individual. It's like it's this thing, but there are all of these other things that make this thing possible, and that's what I was trying to kind of invoke by painting some of these root systems behind the iconographic confection. And a confection box was essentially a pill box that was used in the medieval ages, where they would dispense candied peppercorns, candied saffron, candied cubibs, almost, and people would take them as you would pills, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that's what we call like confections too. Oh yeah, they actually still in Europe, you can buy them in like the little tins, almost like we get Altoids in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have like at candy stores and stuff, they have these little confections and they usually are related to an herb. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Even though we've also then translated that term confection to mean like little bonbons as well. Here in America. Yeah, but you do still find those little herbal confections. You know, they're quite intriguing and they usually have quite a remarkable taste. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of bonbon thing, like when I thought about the confection box as a suite of paintings, I was like, oh, I want to make them sweet, you know, kind of sweet, small paintings.
Right. So maybe we should open it up to questions now. Thank you for walking us through both the evolution of your work and through the show. So I'll turn it over to Asya to see if there are any questions now.
So everybody, yeah,
there we go.
Hello. I don't see anything yet. So if you would like to ask a question, again, there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen. You can click onto it and just type a message, and we'll be happy to read it out loud for either Angelina or Paul.
And in the meantime, then I have one that I had in mind for Angelina. Do you, what kind of preparatory drawings or sketches do you make in like the paintings? Because I see like in the area even behind you right now, there's some drawings on the wall. So what's your process for preparation, like for elements of the paintings?
Well, this is where I wish I could go back and speak to my much younger self when I was leaving photography and rejecting it so completely because I felt like it overdetermined what I would paint on the canvas. All I needed to do was to make a drawing of the painting and work off of that. Like, it was really just putting that step of the one thing in the other. That kind of allowed me to start constructing images. And so now my paintings generally work the best when I do multiple drawings. Like I might have to do 6 or 7 versions of a drawing to work out composition, maybe the geometry or the shape organization of the composition, and sometimes the color and lighting. And what that allows me to do then when I go to the painting, I have to make fewer decisions on the fly. I can be like, okay, I know I need this to be this dark or this color or arranged around this shape, and I can just work much more quickly at that point.
Yeah, it's a similar process that I use when I'm writing. I don't make an outline per se, but I'll like take lots of notes on different things. Like when I'm even preparing for this interview with you or a conversation with you, you know, I make notes after looking at paintings. And then, you know, I'm able to formulate questions in that way. Or if I'm writing a few paragraphs on someone's work, to put those elements together, I make it akin to like collaging, you know, and I see that that's part of like your process as well.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And do you work on more than one painting at a time?
Yes, absolutely. Especially with the drying time for the pours, you know, like I can come in and do a pour, and then I'm not going to be able to move that canvas for the rest of the day, you know, so I have to have some other places to go to work.
Yeah.
So we have one question from Lily. Lily says, thank you for your remarks, Angelina. I'm curious about your thoughts about the permanence or lack thereof. of objects/ideas and their existence in the physical world, and how your material and studio process influence that belief.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there. Well, I would say that on a very grand scale of time, it's all very impermanent. I would also say that I've taken steps to make my paintings archivally sound. I start with acrylic, there's a coat of Gamblin PVA size, and then the oil goes on top of that. So they should last a long time. But let me take a look. The things that I paint are ephemeral, the pottery gets cracked, and returns to dust. The roots go into the compost, the leaves wilt, we go back into the ground. And so I think that there is real embrace of the temporal nature and the fleetingness of it all, both in the attitude and in the paintings. Does that answer your question?
It seems like, I was going to just add that this particular show, is so much, because I've seen how much research you've done, both through just literature and imagery and travel. And so you're resuscitating these things that, they sort of form the background of our modern life, but we don't really have a connection to how things are grown, what they look like in the original, as opposed to in the powdered, crushed in the bottle and the pill. And so you're through your reinvention and, everything you're doing in the studio and in your mind, it's kind of making something, giving it maybe not permanence, but certainly I would say resuscitation. If you're taking something from 1,000 years ago that might have, like you said, might have only been an oral history to begin with, and you're giving it an image now. So it's really remarkable.
And I think there is that kind of that these ideas bubble up. This wasn't something that I was specifically thinking about because I started this body of work before COVID, but I was reading about somebody's response where they were, about a year ago, when things were starting to get very, very bad. And there was so little essentially that we could do. The only things that you could do was, to mask, to stay distant, to wash your hands. Like there wasn't necessarily chemical medicine. And there, and nor was there necessarily herbal medicine, to address what was going on. But that feeling of kind of being drawn back to the elements of comfort and care that are closest at hand, that you do have access to, I think is something that a lot of people were thinking about and experiencing.
Interesting. Well, it looks like everyone else so far is being shy, but that was a terrific question. So I encourage anybody else to have a question to feel free. We'll give you guys a couple of minutes, but otherwise just wanted to sort of say thank you to everybody, especially Paul and Angelina, of course, for, your fantastic conversation. And Paul, I really loved how you transcended from the beginning to the middle to this final stage. And of course, there is no final stage because we're going to have another show, and probably Angelina will plunge even further into some of these themes. And it's having followed Angelina's career for such a long time, it's even interesting and new kind of for me, of course, to have your perspective. So I really enjoyed it. And I hope you guys have too. And I'm looking and I'm not seeing any other questions. So I think, it's about noon. It's been about an hour, and I want to thank everybody again. And just to remind everyone, you've got till 6 to see Angelina's show in person, 537B West 23rd Street. Otherwise, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.